Okay, so you want to own a brewery. Stainless steel tanks gleaming under warehouse lights. A taproom full of regulars raising pints with your logo on the glass. A beer with your name on it sitting on shelves at the grocery store down the street. You picture yourself as the local hero who turned a home brewing hobby into a genuine business, pouring your own creation for people who actually want to drink it. That's the fantasy. Here's the actual business hiding underneath it. An industry that added more new breweries in the past decade than at any point since before Prohibition, until it didn't. An industry where the single most expensive line item isn't the beer itself, but the aluminum can it goes in, and where a genuinely well-run, beloved local brewery can still close its doors not because the beer was bad, but because distribution economics in this industry have quietly become almost impossible for anyone without serious scale. Some brewery owners have built genuinely valuable regional and national brands worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Others have watched a beloved taproom slowly bleed cash for years before finally closing, unable to compete against both craft rivals and the massive industrial brewers who still control the overwhelming majority of the market. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why owning a brewery looks nothing like the romantic image of the craft beer renaissance, and why an industry that seemed unstoppable for 2 straight decades has recently entered its first genuine, sustained contraction. What you're actually buying before the money makes sense. You need to understand that brewery describes several genuinely different businesses that happen to share the same basic production process. The simplest version is a taproom-only brewery, a business that brews beer specifically to sell on-site, capturing the full retail margin on every pint without ever dealing with a distributor, a distribution truck, or a grocery store shelf. The second version is a packaging brewery, one that cans or bottles its beer for sale beyond the taproom, whether through self-distribution to local bars and liquor stores or through a formal wholesale distributor that handles the logistics of getting product into a much wider geographic footprint. The third version, and the one that requires genuinely serious capital, is a regional or national production brewery, operating at a scale where the taproom, if it exists at all, is essentially a marketing showcase rather than the actual revenue engine, with the real business built around wholesale distribution across dozens or hundreds of markets. These are meaningfully different businesses with meaningfully different economics. A taproom-only brewery keeps the entire retail dollar but is fundamentally capped by the physical foot traffic of a single location. A packaging brewery gains geographic reach, but immediately surrenders a substantial share of every dollar to the 3-tier distribution system that governs alcohol sales in the United States, a legal structure dating back to the repeal of Prohibition that legally requires beer to pass through an independent distributor on its way from brewery to retailer in the overwhelming majority of states. Understanding which of these models a given brewery is actually running, and just as importantly, which one its owner assumed they were running when they first opened, explains an enormous share of why some craft breweries thrive while outwardly similar ones, making outwardly similar beer, quietly struggle. The cost of actually building the thing, opening even a modest craft brewery, requires a surprisingly serious capital outlay before a single pint gets poured, and the escalation from brewpub to genuine production facility happens fast. According to industry cost data tracked by the Brewers Association, the trade group representing the American craft brewing industry, opening a small brewpub with a limited on-site brewing system can require an initial investment in the range of $250,000 to $500,000, covering the brewing equipment itself, tanks, a mash tun, a boil kettle, walk-in cold storage, and the build-out of the taproom space, kitchen equipment if food service is planned, and the specialized plumbing and drainage a brewery requires. Scale up to a genuine production brewery intended to package and distribute beer beyond a single taproom, and costs climb substantially, with a mid-sized production facility commonly requiring $1 million to $5 million or more in startup capital, driven heavily by the cost of larger fermentation and bright tanks, a canning or bottling line, which alone can run $500,000 to over $1 million for a genuinely efficient packaging line, and the walk-in refrigerated warehouse space needed to store finished product awaiting distribution. Licensing and regulatory compliance represents a smaller but genuinely important cost category unique to this industry. Since brewing beer for sale requires federal permitting through the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, along with state and often local licensing, a process that can take months to navigate and that comes with ongoing compliance obligations, excise tax reporting, and label approval requirements that don't exist in most other food and beverage businesses. Water and wastewater infrastructure deserve specific attention here because it genuinely surprises first-time brewery owners. Brewing consumes an enormous volume of water, commonly estimated at somewhere in the range of 5 to 7 barrels of water for every barrel of finished beer once cleaning, cooling, and packaging processes are all accounted for, and many municipalities require breweries to install pre-treatment systems for their wastewater specifically because spent grain, yeast, and cleaning chemicals can overwhelm a standard municipal treatment system if discharged untreated. An infrastructure cost that can run into the tens of thousands of dollars and is frequently underestimated in a new brewery's initial business plan. The ingredient cost nobody expects to dominate here. That's the detail that catches almost everyone who assumes the beer itself. The malt, hops, yeast, and water represents the dominant cost in a packaged product, and it's a genuinely counterintuitive fact about this specific industry. Packaging frequently costs more than the liquid inside it. According to cost breakdowns commonly cited across the craft brewing industry, the aluminum can itself, along with the label or printed graphics on it, can represent 30 to 40% of the total cost of goods for a packaged beer, frequently exceeding the combined cost of the malt, hops, and yeast that actually went into brewing it. This dynamic has become considerably more pronounced over the past several years as aluminum prices have experienced genuine volatility, driven by broader industrial metal demand and, at various points, tariff policy affecting imported aluminum, forcing brewers to either absorb rising packaging costs directly into shrinking margins or pass them along to increasingly price-sensitive consumers in an already crowded, competitive beer market. Hops represent the second major raw ingredient cost, and pricing here varies enormously depending on the specific variety. Since certain especially popular, flavor-intensive hop varieties favored in the hazy IPA styles that have dominated craft beer's most commercially successful segment over the past decade command meaningfully higher prices than traditional bittering hop varieties, and hop contracts are frequently negotiated years in advance given the multi-year lead time required to establish new hop acreage, meaning a brewery's hop costs for a given year were often locked in based on market conditions that existed considerably earlier. Malt, the fermentable grain base of virtually all beer, represents a more stable, commodity-like cost, though craft brewers focused on specialty or single-origin malt varieties, part of the broader premiumization trend that has defined much of craft beer's marketing positioning, pay a meaningful premium over the bulk malt pricing available to the large industrial brewers who purchase grain at a scale no craft operation can match. Add yeast, water treatment, and the specific costs of maintaining consistent quality control. Since inconsistent beer quality can permanently damage a young brewery's reputation in a way few other consumer products face such immediate, socially visible consequences for, and the true cost of goods for a packaged craft beer commonly runs 25 to 40% of its wholesale price. A genuinely thin margin once packaging volatility and specialty ingredient costs are factored in. The three-tier system, and where the margin actually goes to understand why, though many craft breweries struggle specifically once they try to scale beyond their own taproom. You have to understand the three-tier distribution system that governs alcohol sales across the overwhelming majority of the United States. A legal structure established after prohibitions, repealed specifically to prevent the kind of vertically integrated saloon tied to brewery control that regulators of that era believed had contributed to the excesses that led to prohibition in the first place. Under this system, A brewery generally cannot sell directly to a retailer, a grocery store, a liquor store, or a bar in most states. Instead, the brewery must sell to a licensed distributor, who then sells to the retailer, who then sells to the consumer, with each tier taking a meaningful cut of the final retail price along the way. According to industry analysis of typical beer pricing structures, a brewery might realize somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% of the final retail shelf price for its packaged beer once the distributors' and retailers' respective margins are factored in, meaning a six-pack that retails for $12 might net the brewery something closer to $5 to $6, a figure that has to cover the actual cost of goods, packaging, and the brewery's own overhead before any profit is realized. This is precisely why the taproom, where a brewery captures the full retail price directly, has become such a central, and in many cases essential, part of the modern craft brewery business model. Since a pint sold across the taproom bar generates dramatically higher margin than the identical beer sold in a can through the full three-tier distribution chain, it's also why finding and maintaining a genuinely committed, well-resourced distributor has become one of the most consequential relationship decisions a growing craft brewery makes. Since a distributor juggling hundreds of different beer brands across its portfolio has limited sales attention to allocate, and a brewery whose products end up neglected in a distributor's warehouse, poorly represented to retail buyers, or simply deprioritized in favor of larger, more established brands the distributor also carries, can find its beer sitting on shelves going stale despite genuinely strong underlying consumer demand, a distribution bottleneck that has quietly ended the growth trajectory of more than one promising regional craft brand, the build that never stops. Arriving running an established brewery involves ongoing costs that extend well beyond the ingredients and packaging that go directly into each batch. Labor represents a substantial and growing cost category, since a genuine production brewery requires not just brewers themselves, but packaging line staff, quality control personnel, warehouse and logistics workers, and, for any brewery operating a taproom, a full hospitality staff of bartenders and servers. And craft brewing wages have risen alongside broader hospitality sector wage growth over the past several years, compressing already thin margins further. Equipment maintenance and eventual replacement represents a genuinely significant ongoing cost, since brewing equipment, tanks, pumps, the canning line itself, operates under constant exposure to cleaning chemicals, pressure cycling, and temperature extremes, and a canning line in particular requires regular, specialized maintenance to avoid the kind of packaging defects, underfilled cans, seam failures, oxygen contamination, that can trigger costly product recalls and genuine reputational damage in an industry where quality consistency is closely watched by an increasingly sophisticated consumer base. Distribution and logistics costs, even for breweries that have secured a genuine third-party distributor, still require the brewery to maintain refrigerated warehouse space, coordinate delivery scheduling, and in many cases provide their own sales representatives, who work alongside the distributors' sales team specifically to maintain retail relationships and secure the kind of prominent shelf placement and tap handle positioning at bars that can make or break a beer's visibility against dozens of competing options. Marketing spend has become an increasingly necessary cost category as the sheer number of competing craft beer brands has multiplied dramatically over the past decade, meaning a brewery can no longer simply rely on making genuinely good beer and hoping word of mouth carries the business, instead requiring active investment in branding, packaging design, social media presence, and local event sponsorship simply to be noticed in an increasingly crowded retail shelf and tap list. Excise taxes represent a genuinely significant, often underappreciated cost specific to this industry, with federal excise tax rates varying based on a brewery's total annual production volume, a tiered structure specifically designed to reduce the tax burden on genuinely small producers, but one that still represents a real, non-negotiable cost that scales directly with a brewery's growth and that state-level excise taxes add to considerably. with rates varying widely by state in ways that meaningfully affect a brewery's regional cost structure and can influence where a growing brand chooses to expand distribution. The great craft beer boom and the contraction that follow. To understand the current state of this industry, you have to understand the genuinely remarkable growth trajectory that preceded it and the recent, sobering reversal that has followed. According to data tracked by the Brewers Association, the number of operating craft breweries in the United States grew from a few hundred in the early 1990s to well over 9,000 by the mid-2020s. An explosive, multi-decade growth trend driven by a combination of shifting consumer taste toward more flavorful, locally produced beer, the relaxation of home brewing and small brewery licensing laws across many states, and a broader cultural shift toward supporting local, independently owned businesses over large industrial producers. This growth was genuinely remarkable by the standards of American manufacturing more broadly, representing one of the few consumer product categories where thousands of genuinely new, independently owned production facilities opened across the country over a relatively short period. But according to more recent Brewers Association data and industry reporting, the total count of operating craft breweries in the United States began experiencing net closures exceeding new openings for the first time in the industry's modern history starting around 2023, a genuine inflection point that industry analysts have attributed to a combination of factors, a broader flattening and, in some categories, outright decline in overall beer consumption as younger consumers have shifted meaningfully towards spirits-based ready-to-drink cocktails, wine, and, notably, cannabis products in states where recreational use has been legalized, combined with the sheer saturation of the craft beer market itself. Since a consumer in most American metro areas today has access to dozens of local craft breweries competing for the same increasingly limited pool of craft beer drinkers, a competitive intensity that simply didn't exist during the category's earlier growth phase when a new craft brewery genuinely represented a novel option in a market previously dominated by a small number of industrial light lagers. This contraction has hit small and mid-sized regional breweries considerably harder than either the very smallest taproom-only operations, which can often survive on genuinely local loyalty and modest overhead, or the largest, most established craft brands that have achieved genuine national distribution scale, creating a genuinely difficult middle tier of the industry. Breweries that scaled up their production and distribution ambitions during the boom years but never quite achieved the volume needed to make that scaled-up cost structure sustainable. Against a now shrinking overall market, the volatility nobody wants to talk about behind the industry-wide contraction. Brewery ownership carries several distinctive, ongoing risks. Consumer taste volatility moves faster in craft beer than in almost any other beverage category, with entire beer styles rising and falling in popularity over just a few years. The hazy IPA boom that defined much of the past decade's craft beer growth has itself shown signs of gradually giving way to renewed interest in lighter, more sessionable styles, and, notably, to the rapid rise of hard seltzer and other flavored malt beverages that compete directly for the same retail shelf space and the same consumer occasion that beer has traditionally owned, meaning a brewery whose entire portfolio and brand identity is built around a currently fashionable style faces genuine risk if that style's popularity fades before the brewery has established enough of a durable, style-independent brand identity to weather the shift. Raw material cost volatility, particularly around aluminum pricing and specific hop varieties, can compress already thin margins with little warning and limited ability for a brewery to quickly pass costs through to consumers in an intensely competitive, price-conscious retail environment where a beer priced noticeably above its direct competitors risks losing shelf placement entirely. Distribution relationship risk, discussed above, represents an ongoing structural vulnerability, since a brewery's growth trajectory beyond its home market depends almost entirely on securing and maintaining genuine sales attention from third-party distributors who represent dozens of competing brands. and a brewery that loses distributor enthusiasm, whether from a change in the distributor's own portfolio priorities, an acquisition that changes the distributor's ownership and strategic focus, or simply the arrival of a hotter, newer brand competing for the same limited sales attention, can see its regional market presence erode with genuinely limited recourse. And finally, the broader secular decline in overall beer consumption among younger American drinkers, a trend that predates and extends beyond craft beer specifically, represents a genuine long-term headwind that no amount of individual brewery excellence can fully offset, since a shrinking overall category means that even a brewery executing every other part of its business well is competing for a smaller total pool of demand than the craft brewers who built the industry's foundational brands a decade or two earlier ever had to contend with. The real case study, the consolidation and struggles of Craft Brew Alliance understand how even genuinely well-established, historically successful craft breweries can struggle against these structural pressures. Look at what happened to Craft Brew Alliance, the parent company formed through the merger of several respected craft brewing pioneers, including Red Hook and Widmer Brothers, two of the earliest and most historically significant breweries of the American craft beer movement's founding generation. Craft Brew Alliance had built a genuinely substantial regional footprint and benefited from a long-standing distribution and investment partnership with Anheuser-Busch, the industrial brewing giant, an arrangement that gave the craft company access to Anheuser-Busch's enormous, nationally established distribution network, a genuine competitive advantage that most independent craft breweries could only dream of securing. Despite this structural advantage, Craft Brew Alliance's core historical brands experienced years of gradually declining sales volume as the craft beer market center of gravity shifted toward newer, more locally focused brands and toward the specific hazy IPA and rotating release model that Red Hook and Widmer's more traditional, established beer portfolio had not been built around, illustrating a genuine structural risk specific to this industry. Even a brewery with real historical credibility and genuine distribution advantages can struggle when consumer taste shifts away from its established core products faster than the company can successfully reposition its brand and portfolio. Anheuser-Busch, which had held a minority equity stake in Craft Brew Alliance for years as part of their partnership, ultimately acquired full ownership of the company in 2020, a transaction that effectively folded one of the craft beer movement's genuine founding companies into the same large, industrial brewing conglomerate that the entire craft beer movement had originally positioned itself as an alternative to, a full-circle outcome that industry commentators widely noted as symbolically significant given Red Hook and Widmer Brothers' foundational status in craft beer's early history. The Craft Brew Alliance story illustrates a genuine structural lesson that has played out across the broader industry. Distribution scale and access alone cannot fully substitute for a brand's ability to stay culturally and stylistically relevant to a consumer base whose taste in this specific category has proven to shift meaningfully faster than in most other beverage categories, and even the deepest-pocketed industrial partnership cannot indefinitely prop up sales of a beer portfolio that a shrinking, taste-shifting customer base has simply moved on from. To scenarios, let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it. In the good scenario, you own a well-run brewery with a genuinely strong taproom that captures full retail margin on a meaningful share of your production. A disciplined, tightly curated portfolio built around a small number of flagship beers with genuine, durable brand loyalty rather than a large, unfocused catalog chasing every passing trend. And a distribution partnership. If you've expanded beyond your taproom, with a distributor who genuinely prioritizes your brand's sales attention and shelf placement, your cost of goods, disciplined around efficient packaging sourcing and stable ingredient contracts, runs in a reasonable 25 to 30% of wholesale revenue, and your combination of high-margin taproom sales and disciplined wholesale distribution generates a genuinely healthy overall operating margin, often in the range of 10 to 15% of total revenue for a well-run regional craft brewery. Figures that represent a genuinely attractive small manufacturing business even before accounting for the cultural cachet and community standing that a beloved local brewery often provides its owner. Across a period of stable consumer demand and disciplined cost management, a brewery in this position can generate durable, if modest by the standards of some other industries we've covered, long-term profitability. Now the harder scenario. You own a mid-sized regional brewery that scaled up production and distribution ambitions during the previous decade's boom years, investing in a larger canning line and broader multi-state distribution specifically to chase the growth trajectory the entire industry seemed to promise. Consumer demand for craft beer broadly has since flattened and, in your specific market, actually declined as competition from an oversaturated local craft beer scene, rising hard seltzer and ready-to-drink cocktail competition, and a broader generational shift away from beer consumption altogether have all compressed your addressable market simultaneously. Your distributor, managing a portfolio of dozens of competing craft brands amid an increasingly crowded market, has shifted sales attention toward a hotter, newer regional brand, and your own products have begun losing shelf placement and tap handles despite no meaningful change in your beer's actual quality. Your fixed costs, the debt service on the expanded canning line, the warehouse lease sized for a distribution footprint you can no longer fully utilize, the packaging costs that have risen with aluminum price volatility, don't meaningfully decrease even as your wholesale volume softens, and you find yourself managing a genuinely difficult multi-year period of declining volume against a cost structure built for a growth trajectory that never arrived. The gap between these two scenarios in a modest forecasting error. It's the difference between a durable, community-anchored small business and a company caught holding expanded production capacity during exactly the moment the underlying category itself began its first genuine contraction. In modern craft brewing history, the real payoff, the difference between brewery owners who build durable, lasting businesses in this industry and those who scale directly into the current contraction, comes down to a small number of disciplined choices that run somewhat counter to the growth at all costs instinct that define much of craft beer's boom era culture, protecting the taproom's disproportionate margin advantage rather than treating packaged, wide distribution beer as automatically the more prestigious or ambitious business model, has proven to be one of the clearest differentiators between breweries that remain genuinely profitable and those quietly subsidizing an unprofitable wholesale business with taproom revenue that was never actually large enough to cover the gap. Maintaining real discipline around production scale relative to actual, proven demand, rather than expanding canning capacity and distribution footprint based on projected growth that assumed the previous decade's expansion trajectory would simply continue indefinitely, has become one of the central lessons the industry's recent contraction has forced onto brewery owners who scaled ahead of demonstrated demand during the boom years, and building a genuinely durable brand identity anchored in quality and community relationship rather than chasing whatever specific beer style happens to be commercially fashionable in a given moment, provides real insulation against the kind of rapid style cycle shifts that have destabilized more than one brewery, whose entire portfolio was built around a single trend's continued popularity. The romance of the taproom, the community gathering around a beer with your name on it, the genuine pride of craft, is entirely real, and it's precisely the breweries that have protected that community relationship and matched their production ambitions to genuinely proven demand, rather than projected demand, that have weathered this industry's first genuine contraction intact. Which means the honest answer to whether owning a brewery can build real, lasting wealth is yes, for the disciplined operators who understand that the taproom pint, not the six-pack on a distant grocery shelf, was often the more valuable business all along. But the industry's recent history has made unusually clear that the breweries that scaled hardest and fastest during the boom are often the same ones now finding the contraction hardest to survive, precisely because they built a cost structure for a growth trajectory the underlying market has stopped providing. And subscribe Alma Discover for more videos. Thank you.